On the 8th of February, the Southern Irish general election took place. And as a direct result of that general election, a huge realignment occurred in relation to the electoral and political landscape of the Southern Irish state. And as a consequence, Sinn Féin secured its highest ever vote in the south of Ireland. We took 24.5% of the popular vote, so we took the largest share of the popular vote of all of the political parties who contested. We secured 37 seats in the Irish Parliament, dell'Irlanda, and the other two large parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, which have dominated politics in the Southern Irish state for almost 100 years, came in second and third place to our party. So the political and electoral landscape changed almost overnight, and immediately that raised questions about how government would be formed. Sinn Féin entered the electoral contest on a mandate to secure a government for change, and the electorate in very large numbers, over 500,000 people, clearly endorsed our message and gave us a mandate to find a government for change. But the nature of the dispersal of votes and the distribution of seats means that an extensive negotiation will be required to establish a coalition government in the south. So Sinn Féin has gone forward in a very confident way to engage with other political parties, particularly on the left, to explore the feasibility of government for change led by the left in the Southern Irish state. The nature of the political system is such that we will need to secure over 80 seats to ensure that there is a government of the left for change which would command a majority. And the reality is that there are not enough left and progressive politicians to provide that majority. The two large parties, the two large conservative parties who have dominated, have refused to engage with Sinn Féin. They have said they will not speak with our party, they will not go into government with our party. Paradoxically, they have said they will not go into government with each other. One is more interested in government with the other than the Fine Gael party would be in going into government with Fianna Fáil. So at this point in time, we have a hiatus. It is possible that the two large conservative parties, if they concluded an agreement, could form a government together with the support of perhaps the Greens, who returned 12 MPs, 12 Teachtaí Dála, and or with the assistance of some of the more centre-right independent candidates. That is possible. The 26th county state, the Southern Irish state, currently is enduring a very, very serious housing and homeless crisis. There is also a very acute health crisis, and there is a deep sense of discontent within society in the south of Ireland that the recovery from the financial crash of 2008 has not in fact translated into a fair distribution of economic recovery and wealth for other citizens. So Sinn Féin's position is that we want to see a fair deal, a fair economic financial deal for families and workers, because it is quite obvious that ordinary working people have not benefited from the so-called economic recovery in the Southern Irish state. It's very much a case of the 1% benefiting, and those who work within the public sector, those who work in rural communities, those who live on the breadline have not benefited or seen any reasonable economic change in their lifestyles. So people are very hard pressed financially and economically, and at the same time they are not getting access to acceptable and sustainable and effective public services. And this is a consequence of the mismanagement, the catastrophic mismanagement of the economy and public services by the two large parties, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, whom, as I explained, have dominated politics and society in the south of Ireland since the formation of that state. We did very well in the north of Ireland in that British general election which took place in December. We returned with 7 members of Parliament. Sinn Féin as a political party does not recognise the jurisdiction of the British Parliament here in this part of Ireland. We are active abstentionist MPs. So before the election in December we had 7 MPs. On this occasion we returned with 7 MPs. We lost 1 seat in Foyle in the northwest, but we secured an historic victory in taking a seat in North Belfast in this city. There are now 2 Sinn Féin MPs out of 4 here in Belfast City, and that is a remarkable sea change when you consider the history of the north of Ireland and the conflict that we have lived through since the end of the 1960s. There is only 1 Unionist MP now in Belfast, and then there is a 4th MP who has been elected from the social democratic nationalist tradition. So when you consider these changes in the context of the Westminster election of December, you will see that there has been a further sea change in relation to political alignment, realignment in the north of Ireland. And yes, we lost 1 seat, but we gained 1 seat. There was a slight downturn in our votes. That was something which was largely characteristic of the election for most parties. But most significant of all, for the 4th successive election since 2017, the political and the electoral majority which has been held by unionism, by the political unionist parties, has been reduced, and as a consequence the reality in the north of Ireland now is that political unionism, that is the Democratic Unionist Party and the Ulster Unionist Party and the very small unionist parties, they no longer command a majority in this state. This was not about populism, this was about change, and Sinn Féin brought forward a vision, a message and a strategy for how change could be delivered. So those who describe that reaction as populism, I think, are delusional. The reality was that the people in huge numbers on the 8th of February used the ballot box to rebel against the status quo, and they sent a very, very serious message back to the Irish establishment, to those whose interests that the Irish establishment have protected for decades, those in the financial cartels, the vulture funds, the bankers and the big property developers, that their way of governance is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Brexit is a disaster for the island of Ireland. It's important to recall that Brexit came about not because of a considered and a thought out change in relation to the relationship between the British state and the European Union. Brexit was a proxy for fighting an ideological civil war within the British Conservative Party. Our view in Sinn Féin is that there are many changes required within the European Union. We have a Euro-critical view of how the European Union functions, but we accept that it is an economic and a political reality within our lives, and as a result we would seek change and reform within the European Union. But we recognise that strategically it is in Irish people's best interests to remain within the European Union. The people here in the north of Ireland voted to remain within the European Union, as did our counterparts in Scotland. It is fundamentally anti-democratic and undemocratic for the vast majority of people here who voted to remain within the EU when that referendum took place in June 2016 to be pulled out of the European Union against our will. The peace process in the north of Ireland is very strong, and the peace process emerged in the late 1980s as a result of intensive negotiation between the Sinn Féin leadership, the British and the Irish governments and other political forces. And in my view, the Irish peace process is now very strong and solid, but it can never be taken for granted. The reality is that there have always been some elements who have opposed the development of the Irish peace process, the direction of the Irish peace process, its political manifestation in the form of the Good Friday Agreement, and the political architecture that has emerged from the Good Friday Agreement in the form of the regional power-sharing government and the all-island political institutions. But these elements are very much a minority. However, they have access to a small amount of weapons and munitions, and periodically then you will see acts of violence taking place in the north against the trajectory of change. But this is in opposition to the greater will of the people. The people have spoken. They want to see peaceful and democratic change continuing, because the work of the Good Friday Agreement has never been completely delivered upon. There is still much more work which needs to be done. I said that the peace process should never be taken for granted, and neither should the political process be taken for granted. So we do face many challenges. One of those challenges comes in the form of small minority elements who would reach for weapons in order to use violent methods to destabilise the peace process and to undermine the power-sharing arrangements here in the north of Ireland. They have no popular support. They do not represent an effective political opposition. They have nothing to offer, and it is significant that the greater amount of their limited energy is spent and focused on conflict within the constituency, within the section of the community from which they claim to come, rather than in relation to achieving any other political objectives. So their agenda is entirely destructive, self-destructive, and of no benefit to the people of Ireland. There are a number of prisoners aligned with some of those small armed groups who are currently imprisoned, north and south. Their numbers would go into the dozens. I think that Brexit has been extremely influential in bringing centre stage a renewed discussion on the prospect for constitutional change across the island of Ireland. There is a new discussion taking place on a widespread basis right across political and civic society about the achievement of Irish reunification. And Brexit has been one of the key dynamics in making that happen. So Irish unity today has a new momentum that has not existed for many, many decades. And I believe that it has now become very organic within society, north and south. New political realities have been created. Brexit has swept away all of the old established constitutional and political and economic assumptions about the status quo. And when citizens are confronted with an immovable status quo, then they will search for alternatives. And occasionally, and we have seen evidence of this, then citizens will look towards alternative political avenues and pathways and political forces who speak about change, but the nature of the change that they offer is perhaps not the type of fundamental change that is required in society to ensure that there is a proper redistribution of wealth, that we see economies working in the interests of citizens, which invests in the development of sustainable public services where the economy is democratised. And when those alternatives are not presented to working people, then they can be attracted by other political agendas. And therefore, it is incumbent upon the left in continental Europe to reflect very strategically on how to organise, how to develop and build alliances across society that embraces all of the impulses for change. The left, in my view, has much more work to do to shape that political narrative, to give expression to that political narrative with a vision and viable political strategies, so that the left becomes a decisive force for change, and that ordinary people recognise and understand that narrative and that message, and that they can become stakeholders and become supportive and take ownership of that agenda for change. So there is much more work, in my view, for the left to do to present that type of alternative strategy and pathway for change across Europe.